Recently, the Territorial Sea Act 2012 Act 750 has hit the headlines again after much discussions on issues related to the Malaysia Agreement 1963. Here, it must be noted that the Malaysia Agreement 1963 has been breached several times through several invalid acts passed by Parliament, which was unconstitutional over the years. The breach caused the encroachment of powers given and guaranteed by the Intergovernmental Committee Report, IGC, the Malaysia Agreement 1963, and the Federal Constitution. Act 750 is among the 4 unresolved issues that the Special Council on Malaysia Agreement 1963 is addressing. The previous packet in Harapan administration had resolved 17 of the 21 Malaysia Agreement 1963 issues. For years, politicians, particularly those from Sabah and Sarawak, have been speaking out on the issue, which has also been used as a platform in various general and state elections. Let's take a closer look at what Act 750 is all about, its history, why the federal government wants to impose Act 750, and why Sabah and Sarawak resist its implementation. The ownership of Sarawak over the continental shelf properly defined in Sarawak Interpretation Ordinance 2005, where the territory of a state means all areas within the boundaries of the state which comprise the territory of Sarawak immediately before Malaysia Day, and includes, by virtue of the Sarawak, alteration of boundaries, order in council, 1954, the continental shelf being the seabed, and its subsoil which lies beneath the high seas contiguous to the territorial waters of Sarawak. The ownership of continental shelf was clarified by the answer given by the British Secretary of State, Mr. Lane MacLeod, in the House of Commons on 10 May 1960. The jurisdiction of the Sarawak government over the continental shelf for the purpose of exploring and exploiting its mineral resources derives from the Sarawak Alteration of Boundaries, Order in Council, 1954, which extends the boundaries of Sarawak to include the adjacent continental shelf, and not from the Oil Mining Ordinance, 1958, which merely confers powers on the government to enable it to regulate exploration and exploitation of certain mineral resources of the shelf. The rights to such jurisdiction are now embodied in the 1958 United Nations Convention on the Continental Shelf. The convention defines the shelf as extending to a depth of 200 meters, or beyond that limit, where the depth of the superjacent waters admits of exploitation, and contains provisions as to the boundaries between the respective shelves of neighboring countries. There is no intention of exercising jurisdiction beyond the boundaries as defined in the convention, or except for the purposes allowed by the convention. Please note, the continental shelf according to United Nations Convention's Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, defines a continental shelf to extend 350 miles from the baseline. Sarawak, Alteration of Boundaries, Order in Council, 1954 decreed that territory of Sarawak included continental shelf, and Oil Mining Ordinance 1958 further established authority of Sarawak government over exploration and exploitation of the continental shelf. Sarawak retained this authority when it formed the Federation of Malaysia in 1963. The case is strengthened by Article 1(3) of the Federal Constitution, which provides that the territories of the individual states of the Federation are the territories comprised therein immediately before Malaysia Day. And according to the Malaysia Agreement 1963, the existing laws of the Borneo states continue in force provided they did not contravene the Constitution. The position was confirmed by the Continental Shelf Act 1966 passed by the federal government of the Federation of Malaysia itself, the preamble of which states that the provisions of the Act are restricted to West Malaysia. According to the principle of Iudice Possidetis Irises, the frontiers inherited from colonial times are deemed not to be subject to alteration. This means the federal government of Malaysia cannot take over, amend or repeal the Order in Council, and that includes Sarawak, Alteration of Boundaries, Order in Council, 1954. In addition to this, Sarawak also laid claim to the ownership of the continental shelf by Article 47(2) of the Sarawak Constitution, which expressed that any land in the state which immediately before the commencement of this Constitution was vested in Her Majesty shall on the commencement of this Constitution vest in the state. The above article in the Sarawak State Constitution is very clear. It did not vest any land to the Federation of Malaya, or vested to the Federation of Malaysia. The land is vested to the state, meaning Sarawak government. This also means the owner of this property is the state, and the only way this property can be given to another is when the Undang-Undang Negeri in full sitting agree to the transfer of such land. The cession of Labuan to be a federal territory in 1984 was a case in point. It is a good example of the proper procedure to give away land from this state. However, there will be political blowback. In the 1985 state general election, Berjaya lost all its seats except 6. The sovereignty rights of the Federation of Malaysia belong to the federal government, but the property rights remain with the state of Sarawak. Through Section 1(1) of the Malaysia Act 1963 Chapter 35, Her Majesty's sovereignty and jurisdiction in respect of the new states shall be relinquished so as to vest in the manner agreed between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Federation and the new states. This means the British only transferred the sovereignty of the state of Sarawak to the new Federation of Malaysia. The case is strengthened by the information from the declassified documents, dated 1 September 1963, on which Mr. Sandys said the British-Malaysia Act, which comes into force on 16 September, provides for the transfer of British sovereignty over Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak to the new Federation of Malaysia. Therefore, under the Malaysia Act 1963 Chapter 35, the federal government of Malaysia has the rights over the sovereignty of the whole Federation of Malaysia, including the sovereignty rights over the territory of Sarawak. This constitutional responsibility is important to be vested to the federal government, so that the federal government can assert and defend Malaysia's sovereign rights over its territorial waters internationally. In all federal systems, it is the federal government that had jurisdiction over matters such as international relations and defense. The federal government of Malaysia has the rights over the sovereignty of the whole Federation of Malaysia. However, the question is, does the federal government has property rights over the territory of Sarawak, specifically territorial waters? Section 75 of the Malaysia Act, number 26, only dealt with succession to property by the Federation in respect of land that was in use by either the United Kingdom government or the Sarawak colonial administration. This is not relevant to the matter of territorial waters. As for Section 76 of the Malaysia Act, number 26, the provision dealt with succession to rights, liabilities, and obligations of the state prior to Malaysia Day. Once again, the matter of Sarawak's territorial waters does not fit in such criteria. Therefore, the federal government has no property rights over the territorial waters of Sarawak. Being vested with sovereignty rights doesn't mean the federal government has the property rights over the territory, including territorial waters, of Sarawak. In the recent case of the dispute over territorial waters ownership of Sarawak, the Sarawak government has no interest whatsoever to take over the sovereignty rights of the federal government over the territorial waters, as it is very important for the federal government to protect and conserve the integrity of the country internationally. However, the assertion of the Sarawak government is justified for the Sarawak rights over the property rights of the territorial waters. Sarawak's position is to assert its property rights over the area of the continental shelf being the seabed, and a subsoil which lies beneath the high seas contiguous to the territorial waters of Sarawak is issued on 24 June 1954 by the Order in Council, which defined the boundary of Sarawak. According to the Constitution of the State of Sarawak, Article 12(1) mentioned that the state shall have power to acquire, hold and dispose of property of any kind, and to make contracts. Therefore, any property belong to the state of Sarawak, the state shall have power over it. Subject to Article 47(1) of the Sarawak State Constitution, subject to the provisions of this article, all property and assets which immediately before the commencement of this Constitution were vested in Her Majesty, for the purposes of the colony of Sarawak, shall on the commencement of this Constitution vest in the state. And specifically, Article 47(2) states that any land in the state which immediately before the commencement of this Constitution was vested in Her Majesty, shall on the commencement of this Constitution vest in the state. According to the Sarawak Interpretation Ordinance, 2005, Chapter 61, property includes a. Money, goods, choses in action, land and every description of property, whether real or personal, and land includes land covered by water and all buildings, and things attached to the land. Here, we can see that the land covered by water is the property rights which include the area of continental shelf being the seabed, and its subsoil, which lies beneath the high seas, contiguous to the territorial waters of Sarawak. The federal constitution was again very clear in mentioning that the revenue from land is the revenue rights of the state of Sarawak under 10th Schedule, Part 3, Sources of Revenues assigned to states, Item No. 2 Revenue from lands, mines and forests. In case, the federal government tries to impose an idea that the sovereignty of the territorial waters of Sarawak belongs to them to justify their rights over the resources over the territorial waters of Sarawak, we know better that the property rights belong to the state of Sarawak. Territorial Sea Act 2012 Act 750 is a law that was passed by Parliament in 2012. Essentially, it outlines the sovereignty and the breadth of the territorial sea of Malaysia, and in respect of its bed and subsoil, which is the layer of soil underneath the seabed. While international law limits the Malaysian territorial waters to 12 nautical miles, 22 kilometers from the coast, Act 750 limits the state's waters to 3 nautical miles, 5.5 kilometers from the coast, including for Sabah and Sarawak. Here, under Section 3.3 of Act 750, for the purposes of the Continental Shelf Act 1966 Act 83, the Petroleum Mining Act 1966 Act 95, the National Land Code Act 5665, and any written law relating to land in force in Sabah and Sarawak, any reference to territorial sea therein, shall in relation to any territory be construed as a reference to such part of the sea, adjacent to the coast thereof, not exceeding 3 nautical miles, measured from the low water line. On 24 November 2011, then Prime Minister Najib Razak repealed 3 emergency proclamations declared by previous Yang Di-Pertua Nagongs in 1966, 1969, and 1977. Therefore, the enforcement of the following laws in Sabah and Sarawak became void, namely, the Continental Shelf Act 1966, the Petroleum Mining Act 1966, and Emergency, Essential Powers, Ordinance No. 7 1969. This means that the continental shelf and all its oil and gas reserves automatically go back to Sabah and Sarawak, because all the above laws no longer enforceable in Sabah and Sarawak. Granted that a new act was enacted in 2012 to address this issue of ownership. Unfortunately, the core issue of the Territorial Sea Act 2012 or Act 750 is the Continental Shelf Act 1966 and the Petroleum Mining Act 1966, both act no longer enforceable in Sabah and Sarawak. There is a Latin maxim that says nemo dat quod non habet, which means you cannot give what you don't have. Petronas can no longer claim ownership because the federal government gave them the continental shelf in 1975 through Section 2.2 of the PDA vesting order. Because by May 2012 the federal government no longer the owner of the continental shelf, it automatically goes back to Sabah and Sarawak. Under the Emergency, Essential Powers, Ordinance No. 7 of 1969, which came into force on August 10, 1969, the territorial waters of all states were limited to 3 nautical miles. The repeal of the Emergency Proclamation meant that the territorial waters of states, notably the oil-producing states of Sabah, Sarawak, Kelantan, and Terengganu, were no longer capped at 3 nautical miles. The excuse given by Nazir Aziz, who served as de facto law minister when Act 750 was passed, said the law was in line with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, of 10 December 1982, a multilateral treaty governing oceans. The excuse was given that as Malaysia is a party to UNCLOS, Act 750 was needed to enforce the provisions of the UNCLOS. Act 750 has come under criticism from Sabah and Sarawak politicians and activists who describe the law as unconstitutional, as it works against the rights and interests of the 2 Bornean states. Warisan Deputy President and Penampang MP Daral Leaking said Act 750 is unconstitutional as it violates Article 2B of the Federal Constitution, which prohibits any alteration of the boundaries of a state without the consent of that state, expressed by a law made by the legislature of that state and of the Conference of Rulers. He said, the federal government should not have rights over our own land and sea boundaries, and its continental shelf, and all these should be dealt with by Sabah and Sarawak. He said that although the federal constitution states that the federal government has full authority over security matters, this does not include matters related to marine resources and minerals. The enforcement of Act 750 means that Sabah will be denied revenue from resources beyond 3 nautical miles. The economic implications are obvious, and we can never monetize our own resources. In 2018, Sarawak Chief Minister Bang Johari Aping openly spoke against Act 750, insisting his state's territorial waters extended to 12 nautical miles from the coast, and not 3 nautical miles as specified under the Act. He said the Act 750 is not valid because Sarawak had never consented to the amendment to the boundary of its territorial waters in Parliament. In 2015, the Kelantan State Assembly approved a motion rejecting Act 750. Then State Human Development, Education, and Higher Education Exco Muhammad Fadzli Hassan said Act 750 denied Kelantan the rights to receive petroleum royalties of 5%.